AskReddit, which is that one thing you still regret doing it? Waiting for the right moment for everything to be perfect to take action, instead of just taking actions and making moments right. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I snapped at my dad for getting me the wrong video game, and I can still see the disappointment in his face. Haunts me to this day. I called my buddy one night because I knew he was having a tough time. I told him I'm coming over. He kept saying no, I'm good. He was less than a mile away. I said okay, and then his mom called me in the morning saying he was dead. And what did he say to me in the phone call? I wish I went over. Succumbing to my fear of rejection. It's crazy how much you can build this up, like it might destroy you, and then when it finally happens you're like, whatever, your loss. Turns out that there's just no point feeling bad about not having a relationship with someone who isn't into you too, and all the pre-moment imagination was about someone like that person, but who liked you too, a variation of them that didn't actually exist, and suddenly there's no real loss, because there was never anything real there. Getting morbidly obese. I no longer am, but some damage is done. I feel that most other mistakes I made can be reversed or mitigated, except this one. Letting my happiness depend on someone else, on the wrong person. The worst part is you don't realize what you did till that person is gone, and your happiness goes with them. Indeed, but lucky for me it's all over and life took a turn into a better way, and I'm ready to travel towards the future. To everybody who is in a similar situation that I was, keep on fighting. There is a future worth fighting there out there, even though sometimes you might not see it or it might seem impossible. In community college, a sociology professor asked us to raise our hands and say what religion we are, voluntarily, of course. This was to get an idea of how diverse the class was. Everyone went around and said the typical Christian, Catholic, Muslim, etc. and that was that. The professor then asked, are there any others? So I raised my hand. I don't really identify with a certain religion. I was raised Christian, but I'm more of an evolution, Big Bang, science type of believer. I explain this to the entire class, and the professor asks if there's a name for it. I say, Scientology. He just kinda smiled and said great before moving on. Then I learned what Scientology is. Then I learned I'm probably agnostic. This experience had no repercussions other than the fact it still makes me cringe knowing people thought I was a Scientologist. This was many years ago when I was a little kid on a holiday with my parents. We went camping and, being the social kid I was, I made friends quickly. We connected through our Game Boys and tried out all the games we had. He borrowed me his cartridge of the Pokemon trading card game so I could play at my own tent. I loved it. When it was time for us to go back home again, I totally forgot it was still in my Game Boy. I said goodbye, got in the car and fell asleep since it was a long drive to my hometown. When we got back I obviously grabbed my Game Boy again only to notice I accidentally left his cartridge in it. I felt so bad. I was scared he thought I had stolen it from him since he knew I liked the game so much. Being scared my mother would be angry, I never explained the situation. I hid the game and never played it again. To this day I am extremely aware of my stuff, especially when I have used other people's things. It's such a silly little thing, but I absolutely still regret it many years later. I didn't take college seriously. I was just going through the motions and never graduated. Now all my closest friends have their careers and are making a good living while I'm stuck in mediocrity. I never thought about the future back then and it hurt me big time. I'm 1000 steps behind everyone else. I missed the last Christmas I had with my grandma to spend it with my now ex-boyfriend who would have otherwise been alone for Christmas. I didn't know at the time it would be our last Christmas with her. We video called, but that isn't quite the same. He broke up with me after I spent a weekend looking after his cat while he was on a work trip. After how he treated me towards the end of the relationship, I realized he really wasn't worth missing out on family time for. I'll probably regret this for the rest of my life. I miss you, Grandma. Not seeing my grandfather before he died. I was 17. Very much in the puppy love stage of my first relationship and convinced she was the one. Got the news that my grandfather had bowel cancer. He was an amazing man. Despite not having much, he always used to try and make things special for us growing up. He'd appear at 7 AM every Christmas morning dressed as Santa. Magic sweets behind cushions in the sitting room. He was a typical grumpy granddad, but underneath that he had a heart of gold. Instead of visiting him, I spent time with her. I had multiple opportunities. Countless times I could have gone and seen him, and I turned those away believing there was always another time. There wasn't. He died before I realized what I'd done. I hope he knew just how much I loved him. He meant everything to me and I didn't even give him the courtesy of saying goodbye. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. Not accepting that some disabilities come with natural limitations and that figuring out how to work around them is key, rather than bareheadedly insisting there is no limitation until you are forced to concede. Only now you're in a situation with no accommodations and no workarounds treatment, personally or professionally, for your limitations. I really regret the amount of drinking I did in my 20s and 30s. While I've been sober for over 2 years and don't plan on ever being intoxicated again, I will never get past the guilt and shame I feel for putting myself and my family through god-awful times and events when I was regularly drinking myself into a coma. Alright, boys and girls, gather round. Long yet interesting story time of my life's biggest regret. I was in my 11th grade standard form whatever. I was one of those popular students who was loved by pretty much the entire educational institution. Good in academics, head student, loved by all the teachers, even the ones who did not teach me, except maybe one or two. Sure, I was a bit on the heavier side, but nobody cared since I was a professional MC who was always hosting events in our institution for free. Stuff like dances, cultural events, holiday celebrations and whatnot, and I had a reputation for being a funny comedian. One day, the principal and I get into a huge disagreement over something, a long story for another time, and my parents and I were under the impression that he handled it horribly. I still am salty about it and feel he handled it horribly 4 or 5 years later, but that is besides the point. So, a couple of days after the principal and I have our huge, public argument, he comes into my classroom to inform me that we are holding a concert organized by a local charitable organization for disabled students. We would have singers, musicians or dancers who were either blind, deaf, dumb and so forth. In front of the whole class I basically just looked him in the eye and said cool, so he proceeded to carry on talking and he started mentioning some things he wanted me to do while I was hosting the event. I interrupted him and said that I had no interest in hosting, and he should find someone else. He got upset, called me immature and left the classroom. A week later, the day of the event is there. Apparently some guy from the charitable institution itself was hosting the event. He was not doing a very good job. He kept fumbling and stuttering. He was nervous and boring. His attempts at humor were met with genuinely uncomfortable spans of silence from the audience. He would react to this silence by repeating his jokes again, as if to say that they were funny, and the only explanation for us not laughing is because we did not hear it properly the first time. Awkward and cringeworthy. Anyway, at some point there was this blind girl about my age up on stage, singing a song. She was accompanied by a couple of blind musicians playing instruments. I think there was a violinist and a pianist. Amazing performance. I genuinely thought they were professional musicians who spent their entire lives dedicated to music. After their performance, the MC announced that the event had ended, and he wanted a student from the audience to come up on stage and deliver a vote of thanks. Awkward silence in the audience. 20 seconds later he repeats himself. He wants one student from the audience to deliver the vote of thanks. Principal, who is sitting in the audience, gets up and walks over to me and asks me to do it. Again, I was incredibly upset with him, so I literally turned my head in the opposite direction and pretended like I could not see him, even though he was standing right in front of me. Laughter from the audience as they saw this. and a couple of my friends were clapping, which further encouraged my childish antics. Eventually the principal just goes around asking different students to do it. Nobody is willing to. All the students in my batch were really shy, and at this point the entire vote of thanks fiasco has gone on for a good 3-4 minutes. Eventually the principal gives up, goes on stage and delivers the vote of thanks himself, and verbally berates all the students present for being such ungrateful people. Then the MC takes the microphone and proceeds to tell us how we should not be shy, and how we should thank those around us when given the chance. Then there was me, in the audience. When the principal started speaking, I was grinning from ear to ear as I felt I had won somehow. Suddenly I realized the blind singer on stage started wiping her face and sobbing, and it dawned on me that I was an idiot. As she was escorted off the stage and down the aisle, I was sitting right near the center. She sort of walked right past me and I could hear one of the volunteers comforting her and reassuring her that she sang very well, and that the audience was just shy. Did not sleep that night, nor the nights that followed, too wrecked with guilt. Yep, years later, I still feel like a huge idiot. If I could, I would go back in time and slap myself right there in the hall, and tell myself to quit being a petty immature idiot. Growing up. Dude, you don't have to do it all the way though. Approach new situations with an open heart and sense of wonder. Never stop learning. Never pass up opportunities to play, explore, treat yourself, adventure. I'm older now but I still love to discover, play, and learn. I made myself a cake in a cup in the microwave today. Isn't that the coolest? Man, everyday adventures. Life is rad.